What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we're going to be looking at 15 different Starship traits that are useful for an energy weapon build. There are a lot of different Starship traits in Star Trek Online, and they all do very different things. Because of this, it can be pretty overwhelming to find useful Starship traits for your build. Now obviously there are a ton of build videos out there to offer suggestions for Starship traits for certain builds, but sometimes a content creator is using a Starship trait that you don't have, so what do you pick instead? That is the purpose of this video, to give you guys more Starship trait options for your builds. Like I said, I'm going to be going over 15 different traits that are well suited to various different kinds of energy weapon builds. Most of them are good for all kinds of energy weapon builds, but some of them are a bit more specific, like beam overload or cannon scatter volley. Also, all but one of these traits is an account unlock trait. Most of them are from C-Store ships, some of them are from legendary ships, one of them is from one of the old recruitment events. The last one isn't an account unlock, but it's really easy to get because it's not attached to a starship. In fact, you might already know which trait I'm talking about because I've talked about it a lot on this channel in the past. If you guessed I was going to talk about onboard dilithium recrystallizer first, good job, you've been here before. Like I said, this will be the only Starship trait on this list that will not be an account unlock. This trait is currently available in the Infinity lock boxes, but because it's not attached to a starship, it can actually be purchased on the exchange for pretty cheap. What this trait does is give a 10% bonus damage buff for every non-weapons power subsystem you have maxed out whenever you activate an engineering ability. So that's a potential for a 30% buff to bonus damage. Now, on its own, this trait isn't actually very good because on an energy weapon build, the only power system you're going to have maxed out is your weapons, and that's the only one that doesn't trigger the damage buff from the trait. So what you want to do is pair this trait with a console called Enhanced Plasma Manifold. This console gives a significant buff to your shields, engines, and auxiliary power levels, making it possible to get the most out of that bonus damage from this trait. The Enhanced Plasma Manifold is also very easy to get because it comes from the Tier 1 Oberth Light Science vessel. The Tier 1 Oberth can be purchased from a ship vendor for 15,000 dilithium, which isn't a lot. Or if you bought it from the C-Store before all the lower tier ships were removed from the C-Store, congrats, you already have it. Next on the list is Improved Critical Systems. This trait also isn't available on a starship. It actually comes from the Temporal Agent recruitment event. Completing all the episode rewards on a Temporal Agent will reward this trait, which can then be claimed on any character on your account. What this trait does is anytime you use an emergency power bridge officer ability, it gives you a small buff to critical chance and critical severity. This one's actually useful on pretty much any sort of damage build, because critical chance and critical severity are two very important stats. It's not a lot of crit chance and severity, but in the end, something is better than nothing. Energy weapon builds in particular are almost guaranteed to have at least one emergency power bridge officer ability, and that's generally emergency power to weapons. Not only because it gives bonus damage to your energy weapons, but also because of this next trait, Emergency Weapon Cycle. Ever since it came out, Emergency Weapon Cycle has been considered a meta trait for energy weapon builds, and that's because it reduces your weapons power cost and increases the haste of your energy weapons every time you use emergency power to weapons. That means your energy weapons will be doing more damage and firing faster at the same time. This trait is available on the Arbiter battlecruiser as well as its Klingon and Romulan counterparts. Next up is Heart of Soul off the Temporal warships. What this trait does is every time you use Attack Pattern Beta or a Temporal operative ability, you gain a small buff to firing cycle haste for your energy weapons and a small bonus damage buff. Now, for Heart of Soul, that bonus damage buff is only applied for phasers, but there are 3 other versions of this trait, each of which gives a bonus damage buff to a different damage type. The way Cryptic released these traits was kind of complicated, and I really don't feel like going over it all in this video, but I did go into greater detail on my top 10 C-Store ships video, so if you're curious to hear more, go check that out, I'll link it down below. I'll just say that technically you get all 4 versions of the trait by picking up just one of any of the Temporal warships, but how they're unlocked is kind of weird. Next up is Promise of Ferocity off the Andorian Thosin Pilot Escort, that's the tactical one, as well as the Lethian and Daewon counterparts. What this trait does is give a small but stacking bonus damage buff to your energy weapons every time you use a tactical or pilot bridge officer ability. Even in small amounts, bonus damage is always a good thing. This next one is pretty useful if you don't like being shot at during TFOs. Strike from Shadows from the Shran Pilot Escort and Mchala Bird of Prey. When you attack an enemy that isn't attacking you, you receive the following buffs. A 60% decrease to your threat generation, that means you'll get shot at less, plus 5% to crit chance, and plus 5% to bonus damage. You'll also placate your target for 12 seconds, meaning it'll be confused, but honestly you're probably going to kill your target long before that ever becomes useful, unless you're fighting a large boss level enemy. This is another one that's good on pretty much any sort of damage type build, not just energy weapons. Next on the list is Supercharged Weapons. This is available on the Endeavor Tactical Star Cruiser and its Klingon and Romulan counterparts, also the legendary Odyssey and Scimitar. What this trait does is buff your energy weapons every time you fire a torpedo. With each torpedo you fire, you gain a stack of Supercharged. This will give the following stat buffs to your energy weapons. plus 10% Cat 1 damage, plus 1.5% to crit chance, and plus 6.6% to crit severity. Supercharge stacks up to 3 times but only lasts for about 20 seconds. So with only one torpedo equipped, odds are you're hardly ever going to get the full 3 stacks of this trait. However, this trait pairs really well with the weapon set from the Discovery Legends reputation. Because you know how the 3-piece set gives you an extra torpedo? That counts towards this trait. So using that, you should be able to get the full 3 stacks out of this trait more easily, but it also means you'll probably only want to use this trait on a phaser or disruptor build, because the dual beam bank of that set only comes in those 2 damage types. The next trait on the list is Entwined Tactical Matrices off the Gagarin and Kuj Miracle Worker battlecruisers. Anytime you activate any level of Beam, Fire at Will, or Cannon Scatter Volley, you get a free hit of Torpedo Spread 1. And anytime you activate any level of Torpedo Spread 1, this trait will automatically activate Fire at Will and Scatter Volley 1. What that means is, by using Fire at Will and Torpedo Spread on your Bridge Officer abilities, you'll be able to keep Fire at Will up 100% of the time, because you'll be constantly swapping between the one you have in your Bridge Officer abilities and the one that's triggered by the Torpedo Spread in your Bridge Officer abilities, and the same would be true for Scatter Volley. Because this trait only affects Fire at Will and Scatter Volley, you're only going to want to use it on either one of those build types. So don't use this if you're running Beam Overload or Rapid Fire, because this trait will override those firing modes if they're active. Next is another one for Cannon Scatter Volley, Withering Barrage. This comes from the Valiant Tactical Escort, its Klingon and Romulan counterparts, the legendary versions of those ships, and the M'Challa refit from the KDF recruitment event. I've said it before, it's kinda hard not to have Withering Barrage by now because it comes on so many different ships. What this trait does is extend the duration of Cannon Scatter Volley by 4 seconds. And that's about it. Basically, it's another option for keeping Scatter Volley active 100% of the time. Though instead of swapping between 2 different versions like with Entwined Tactical Matrices, it just extends the duration of the one of your Bridge Officer abilities. So if you're using Scatter Volley 3, you will always have Scatter Volley 3, which is why this one has a little bit more damage potential than Entwined Tactical Matrices for Scatter Volley. I should also probably note that you do not want to use both of those traits at the same time, because Entwined Tactical Matrices will just be overriding any extended time that Withering Barrage is giving you. Next is probably the newest trait on this list, Energy Overdrive off the Da Vinci Miracle Worker Escort. Anytime you activate a Beam Firing Mode ability, you gain the following buffs for 10 seconds. Plus 100% to flight speed, plus 100% to turn rate, and plus 10 to 50% to your energy weapons. This damage buff will scale based on your distance to your target, kinda like how Narrow Sensor Bands works, except this is only a Cat 1 damage buff. Still not a bad trait though. Even at Cat 1, 50% is still a nice damage buff. Now, even though the damage buff applies to all of your energy weapons, it's only going to be triggered on beam firing modes, so this is only going to be useful on Beam Overload or Fire at Will builds. Now, these next 5 traits are actually from legendary ships, which are more expensive than C-Store ships, but they are still account unlocks, so I figured they were still worth mentioning. The first is the Best Diplomat off of the legendary Miracle Worker Constitution. This trait works pretty much the same way as onboard dilithium or crystallizer. You get a 10% bonus damage buff for each non-weapons power subsystem you have maxed out, but the difference is that this damage buff is only applied to your beam weapons, and the buff is only triggered by Beam Fire at Will or Beam Overload, meaning this one is only going to be useful on beam builds. That said, this is still a pretty nice trait, especially when paired alongside onboard dilithium or crystallizer. Next is Overpowered and Overgunned off the legendary Defiant. This is another one that's similar to a trait we've already talked about. It works a lot like Emergency Weapon Cycle. It buffs your firing cycle haste and lowers your weapons power cost, except this one is triggered by Beam Fire at Will, Beam Overload, Cannon Rapid Fire, or Cannon Scatter Volley. The duration of this trait is a bit different because it's determined by your global crit chance. So the higher your crit chance, the more you'll get out of this trait. That said, even maxed out, it still won't be as long as Emergency Weapon Cycle. So while Emergency Weapon Cycle is still better, pairing the two is actually really beneficial to your DPS on any energy weapon build. Next up is Best Hope for the Empire off of the legendary Galaxy Dreadnought. Activating any version of Beam Overload or a Javelin ability, that's the Spinal Lance ability some Dreadnoughts come with, will give the following buffs. Plus 10% bonus all damage, and plus 50,000 temporary hull. Now the temporary hull, that's hardly worth mentioning. But bonus damage is always nice, and the fact that it's bonus all damage is even nicer, because that means it'll buff all the damage you do, not just from your weapons. The downside is that this is only triggered by Beam Overload or Javelin abilities. Javelin abilities generally have a cooldown of 2 minutes, so I would not rely solely on those to trigger this trait, so I would only use this on a Beam Overload build. The next trait is Deadly Appearances from the legendary Burrell Bird of Prey. When decloaking, this trait gives the following buffs. Plus 50% shield penetration to your projectiles, and plus 50% firing cycle haste to your energy weapons. So if you have a build that's reliant on going in and out of cloak, this could be a pretty useful trait, especially because 50% firing cycle haste is a lot of haste. Haste is always good for any weapons-based build, but is especially important for Beam Overload. And for the last trait on the list, Preferential Targeting. This technically isn't a legendary trait because it originally came off of the low-buy version of the NX, but it also comes in the legendary version, so you can still get this trait as an account unlock. And actually the low buy version is in a Muds bundle, so technically there are 2 ways to get this trait unlocked on your whole account. Anyway, what this trait does is anytime you activate Fire at Will or Scatter Volley, it will buff Beam Overload and Cannon Rapid Fire by 100% Cat 1 damage. So if you're running a Beam Overload build, you can put Scatter Volley on one of your bridge officers. Even if you don't have any cannons equipped, that Scatter Volley will still buff Beam Overload. You don't want to use Fire at Will with it because Fire at Will will share a cooldown with Beam Overload. And you can do the opposite to buff Rapid Fire. So yeah, those are 15 different Starship traits useful for an energy weapon build. I hope you found this useful for setting up your own build. Now, like with the Build Basics series I did a while back, this will also be part of the series. So eventually I'll do videos going over traits for torpedo builds, then for EPG and control builds, and for tank builds. Though with each of those I'll probably limit it to 10 traits. For this video I decided to bump it up to 15 just because of how much variety there is for energy weapon builds. Anyway, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I know I haven't brought the mask out in a while, and that's largely because most of you aren't actually watching these outros, but trust me, it's still there. Right in the closet. Ready for me to go get it. And don't think I won't. So yeah, if you could do all that stuff, I'd really appreciate it because it does help the channel. Anyway, my name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.